My relationship with ecology and the ecological probably started around 2014. At the time I was working at Serpentine, which is a contemporary non-for-profit art gallery in a beautiful park in Kensington in London. And I worked there for several years before 2014 as a curator of public programs, which essentially means all the programs that occur in time rather than in an exhibition context. So everything from conversations to film, to performance, to music, and so on. And as part of that role in public programs, we every year organized a huge festival of participations from all disciplines that we called the Marathon because it was very long. It lasted for about a weekend, sometimes 24 hours in a row, sometimes 2 days of 12 hours, so just a very long event that brought together lots of different perspectives in very, very short order. So it's a little bit like TED, like one thing after another, but always around one particular word that all practitioners would then resonate with. Every year was different, and I had worked on the poetry marathon, the map marathon, the garden marathon, and so on. And then eventually we landed on extinction. And this was in response to an invitation or a prompt by the artist Gustav Metzger, whose life was dedicated to kind of rallying the cultural world against the advent of extinction of species specifically. And Gustav was very close to Serpentine, was very close to us, and he sort of came into the office and said, I'm not really leaving until you do something really serious about extinction. So we started preparing the Extinction Marathon together with my colleagues. And as we prepared it, the subject, it's almost like the subject went inside my soul more than so many other things that I did or have done. I remember having these very intense dreams. I remember sort of having a sense when the festival finished that we weren't actually finished. So my first instinct was to head straight for the artistic director, my boss, and say, look, I know that we have to change the topic every year, but I think that this one is the big one. So I think that maybe we should do every marathon about extinction from here. And he laughed. And that didn't happen, even though the following 3 years were more or less dedicated to thinking about different avenues into the question of ecology and the environment. Fast forward a few years, it's 2018. I have left Serpentine for a year in order to have my baby. And during that time, I started to realize that I was learning through the process of caring for this baby how to communicate with a non-human being. That is to say that, of course, babies are human, but they also don't communicate in the way that, we use human language in order to communicate. They communicate through much more affective, much more sensorial ways in the way that we communicate perhaps with non-human beings. So that was the first learning of being a mother, was we can grow the sense of responsibility and care by attending to things that aren't language alone. And the second one had to do with time. It had to do with the fact that I know that my son's life will be longer than mine. And therefore, it's almost like I take responsibility for, or I care about an amount of time that is longer than my own lifespan. Now, that's a very small shift in time, but that very small shift can then be adapted in the imagination to encompass much longer shifts. So one of them was non-human language and the other one was essentially non-human time. So I was in a kind of wilderness and emerged back into the workplace, and I realized that the art organization as a sector, we did not have language or even desire to attend to the urgencies and the crises of planetary breakdown. And so I started to think about this and developed a project called the General Ecology project, which looked at influencing the whole organization so that it would take up a kind of sense of purpose around environmental justice, environmental balance, and that it would develop the sense of purpose not only by programming things, exhibitions, events that would be about climate change, but by also adapting its own structures and its own ways of working to a more ecosystemic view of things. And so the first thing that we did was creating a role. Essentially, my role became curator of General Ecology, which happened to be the first role of a contemporary art museum entirely dedicated to ecology and art intersections in the world. And now you will see that actually some of them have emerged over time. And that was just to make the point that you don't only want to do things about climate change, ecology, or the environment, because we are not outside of it, we are inside of it. And as a result, we need to change our structures, our systems, our institutions, our infrastructures to reflect that fact. I was always very interested by cybernetics and the way that cybernetics borrows from ecology a way of understanding these large-scale systems that we otherwise don't understand. And of course, the cultural institution is a marker within a larger network of knowledge making, which is culture as a whole. And I was interested in how do you hack into that system in order to really infuse the entire organization with an ecological purpose. That was 2018. And eventually by 2023, the Department of Ecologies was properly established in the organization. Thinking about the ecological and making a kind of commitment to that turned around my entire curatorial practice completely. It transformed it forever, I think, in some very simple and practical ways, and in some very intellectual or philosophical or even metaphysical ways. Firstly, as a curator of public programs, I would meet hundreds of people and often work with them for a very short amount of time. And what changed was that I started to work on much larger projects, much longer ones, with a much smaller number of people, because there was a very strong research component to the work that we were doing with ecology. So the outputs might end up looking a little bit like before, except with this kind of focus on particularly environmental subject, but we never let those subjects go, so we were never finished with the kind of investigation. If we look at some of the most important research projects that we ran during the years of General Ecology, we can see that there was 7 years of in-depth and interdisciplinary concentration on the question of what makes a non-human consciousness or a non-human intelligence. And to try and answer that question, you need anthropologists, you need artists, you need writers, you need speculative designers, you need people that think about urban space, you need people that think about politics. You need all kinds of people to kind of gather together and make these little sort of task teams of research. Another one was, for example, how to live and learn from microbiology to microeconomics to the micropolitical, how those different forms of looking at the micro scale could actually influence one another and offer suggestions and support for one another. That project was called Microhabitable. And then we did a lot of work on climate and environmental justice, trying to bring visibility to those frontline movements that are at the front line not only of environmental breakdown, but also on extraction situations, very complex and contested situations in which, for instance, our transition to a greener, more electrified future requires the mining of lithium in areas that are often indigenous land, and that destroys the ecosystems of those land and makes life almost impossible. So how do we start to negotiate the infinitely complex, given that the earth is infinitely complex? Those things are just an example of the kinds of project that by definition, by virtue of the question and the size of the question, cannot be addressed in a one-off kind of way. That is to say that I became much more invested in and interested in the stuff in between the things that we say, the things that we know, the invisible air, the assumptions, the cultural elements that we give for granted and therefore have stopped even looking at or even recognizing their existence. That nevertheless shape the way that we build our civilization. Which invisible infrastructure is holding up the certainties that we have about living on this planet and how? Which invisible infrastructure is determining the way that we think about time, the way that we think about the future, the way that we think about our own mortality or the planet's own mortality? All of those invisible little threads that when a civilization radically changes, or as we look at the changes over long periods of times of different civilizations, those threads also change and they determine a completely different attitude towards one another, society, the way that we organize our structures, and also the way that we relate to the planet. So it really made me a lot more hesitant, a lot less willing to bring solutions to the audiences that I worked with, a lot more doubtful in a sense, so instilled with a certain amount of doubt, but also with an enormous romanticism. Kind of the romanticism that comes with really wanting to learn or really wanting to understand, or feeling great joy when things just start to click together and make sense even if they're really far away. So say, for instance, a microbiologist is thinking about a form of consciousness and an anthropologist is talking about another. A simultaneity in a physicist's vocabulary and simultaneity in a writer's vocabulary. All those things are not accidents that they connect to one another because we build our societies together. But we never take the time, or very rarely do we take the time to actually think about, yes, but what structures us, what brings us, what holds things in place, invisibly.
Thank you.
Artists are fundamental and also very well placed to do a kind of work that I don't believe any other industry or art form can really do. I think too often for too long in the last, let's say, decade of art and climate activism, have we asked of art to do the work of mobilizing people and raising awareness. And I think often the climate policy world thinks that artists are glorified graphic designers of scientific facts and data. What we know a very long time into this attempt is that even when people understand, that doesn't go very far towards changing the systems that are currently holding the world in place and that are also currently creating a giant hole through which we will all fall quite soon. Because that's not what artists do, in my opinion. Artists make worlds. They borrow from all the other different forms of knowledge. They sense into the kind of invisible cultural threads of the moment, and then they retranslate it into forms of world making, forms of making sense differently of what our place is on the planet right now. And so if we allow for art to be as speculative and forward thinking and propositional and imaginative as I think art can be, then what it does is, rather than work at the level of awareness, it starts to work at the level of culture. And I will try and explain what I mean by that. Awareness is something that we know is happening. It manifests itself in our conscious self, and it changes what we talk about in a kind of very surface layer of our behavior. It might change our behavior tomorrow. Does it change it in the long term? Rarely. Culture is the thing we are not aware of, but that invisibly structures and determines the ways that we behave, the ways that we vote, the ways that we move, the ways that we organize ourselves in society. And so what we want is not so much to intervene only at the level of awareness, but at the level of culture. In a sense, you want something to be absorbed so much that it disappears. And I think artists are especially best placed to do this kind of work because they really build and create possibilities of alternatives. Now, we live in a world that has really shaped us to believe that there is no other way for today to be. That is not true. That is an ideological position that serves certain interests whilst ignoring the needs of others. I certainly will not be the person to suggest what the other model or the other possible world is, but we need a form of expression, a form of, let's say, human knowledge making. We need a form of expression that in some way runs through all the possible simulations, runs the prototypes. And in the art world, you can fail. It doesn't really matter. We're not operating on hearts in a war zone. We are really just building worlds, prototyping worlds, running through simulations of how different ways of, thinking of ourselves and thinking of our planet are. Obviously not all of art does this, but the art that I work with is really interested in this question of worlding and world making. And for me, it should be not to make people understand or to rise people into forms of guilt or forms of unhappiness or forms of alarm or forms of least of all desperation, but rather to sort of take audiences by the hand and offer possibilities of alternative ways of world making. I worked on a project at Serpentine called Back to Earth. The project invited around 64 artists to propose an artwork that would be at the same time an ecological or environmental campaign, prototype, intervention, suggestion, proposal, and so on. We left it very open. We spent years having very meticulous conversations with every artist that we had invited and gathering a little bit, almost like a map of what artists think their roles in the environmental are and can be, where they see impact can be achieved, measured, even just suggested. And what we did once we had this incredible archive of material, we realized some of those campaigns and initiatives and not all of them, and they were incredibly different from one another. So once we had them all and we had catalogued them all, we tried to make sense of them. And I proposed a way of organizing them through kind of vectors, which were imagining, I think I called them public speculations, places, and systems. And that was to try and make sense of the ways in which they thought intervention and impact. So if we think about artworks that look at the public as the primary, let's say, target, then awareness raising is absolutely the aim of those particular projects. And that impact is really easy to measure. You measure how many people saw it, how many people donated to the cause, how many people engaged, how many people reposted. The public category of artworks is a fairly easy one to put in relation with questions of impact. We called systems any intervention and project that, whilst being an artwork, also had as an aim kind of making an intervention into a particular system or hacking into it. So say, for instance, changing something about school meals across the country, trying to change a piece of policy, trying to change a tiny little piece of the curriculum of education. Now, that impact is obviously harder to measure, but it's still achievable. Did that change in the system occur? For how long? To what extent? Is it scalable? Is it multipliable? So far, so good. Then we go into places, which again was a way of making sense of projects that had a commitment, very, very specific, but to a particular place. So, for example, I am an artist and I make artworks, but I am also committed to building an agroforestry farm in the forests of French Guiana, where we can plant cacao and also teach women how to be birth doulas. This is a real project by Tabitha Rezer called Amakaba. In the face of that project, we had to ask ourselves, what is it that we want to be or do as an art organization? Do we want to take pictures from Amakaba and bring them into the gallery? Or do we want to listen to what the needs of that particular place are and try and bring knowledge, support, resources, and expertise to those places, from water infrastructure to building a website to all of that. So in fact, the return that came into the galleries themselves was relatively invisible, but we could ourselves measure the impact of the project from the point of view of how much actual support to these particular places we were able to bring. And we tried to do it in the way that made the least amount of claims possible, so that it was really about transforming the organization to become a support structure for something or somewhere else. And then what we called speculations was a number of artistic projects that looked like there is no way of measuring their impact. There is no way of putting data or a KPI or any kind of number to the project itself. And nevertheless, we believe in their not only right, but necessity to exist, because we know that things get influenced over the long term and as we change minds, hearts, and cultures. The easiest way of looking at that mode of making art is to think about sci-fi. I had once a conversation with a very dear friend who is an expert in art and technology. And in a moment, at a bar, he just said, well, isn't it really funny that our technological devices have ended up looking very similar to the ones that were described in sci-fi books, 40 years ago. And I found myself going, well, it's not really that weird if you look at it from the other point of view. That is to say that those designers that are making technological objects today were kids once, and as kids, they read sci-fi. And so whether they know it or not, cultural forms eventually in the long term influence other systems and structures and forms of the world. So never let speculations go, because you don't actually know where these things will end up and how. And never, underestimate the impact that things have on the unconscious, not only on the conscious mind. Sun and Sea is an opera performance. Now we kind of jokingly call it an immersive musical because we think it's going to do really well if we call it that. But it's an opera performance that was created by 3 artists from Lithuania, Rugile Bardziukaitė, Vaiva Granite, and Dina Lapelytė. And because of their individual, let's say, areas of expertise, the natural artistic form of their collective work was an opera, because you need a director, essentially, a musician and a writer, and that's roughly the outline of each one's work. When we decided to present it in Venice to represent Lithuania at the Biennale of Venice of 2019, we found a building and we put on stage a beach. And that beach was created artificially through lighting and through bringing tons of sand into the actual building. And on the beach are beachgoers who are in fact singers. There's also dogs, there's also kids, there's all kinds of chaos on the beach, as it's supposed to be. It's meant to look as realistic as possible. And then during the course of an hour-long opera, which in fact loops, so in Venice we had an infinity of loops. The perception from the audience's standpoint was that the beach would just be singing all the time, forever. It's kind of uncanny after a while. But the singers on the beach are singing their everyday lives, their daily worries, they're having little conversations, complaining about rubbish on the beach, kind of looking at the sky. They're doing all kinds of really mundane, everyday things. Except if you listen carefully, you notice that in each one of the arias, there is a kind of suggestion of a changing planet, of a changing climate. You have one singer that's singing an aria about how beautiful these colorful plastic bags are as they swirl around and dance with jellyfish in the water. You have another one that's complaining about having found a certain kind of mushroom in the wrong kind of season. So the opera doesn't, let's say, hit you over the head with the message of climate change or breakdown, and it doesn't even particularly tell you to feel any particular way or not. All it puts on stage is real life and the ways in which this huge thing that is a huge existential risk for so many humans on the planet is something that we can't fully grasp cognitively in our day-to-day life. Very, very strangely, our audience in Venice was extremely moved. Everyone who walked in would walk out in tears, which was really unexpected for us. But as it met the, let's say, environment of Venice, we were very keen on it having an impact not only on the people that saw it, but on the city that hosted it. So the way that we thought about the artwork was not only the beach that's inside the building, but actually the entire apparatus of us opening a pavilion in Venice. So there were a few things, small interventions that we did into the city or with the city of Venice. Our site was inside a military zone that had never been open to the public. So we had neighbors from the surrounding areas that came in and said, "Oh, I've never seen this door open in the 40 years that I've lived here." They'd come in, they'd see the opera, and then they'd come back the next day as volunteers on the beach. We had that kind of relationship with the neighborhood. I also kind of love the idea of demilitarizing a military zone in bikinis. It was really funny. You would see the colonel walking in this direction, and then the bikini-clad, me in bikini with a baby in a pram walking in the opposite direction. And it was just, it had this aura of absurdity that I think is really helpful in the context. And then, for instance, we worked with a cooperative of inmates from the male prison of Venice to screen print over the vinyl catalogue as a way of connecting their work to the work of the printers that actually printed the catalogue itself. And then once the sand was removed from the pavilion, we worked with the city of Venice to bring that sand to areas that didn't have many playgrounds available for children. And so we created some playgrounds in slightly less touristy and more deprived areas of Venice with that sand. It was really about thinking about, let's say, the footprint of the piece, not from a simply carbon data-driven standpoint, but actually to think about the entire kind of existence of that piece in that place at that time with those people and so on and so forth. I was at the Serpentine for a sum total of 16 years from the moment I first walked in the door as an assistant, and it took that long to get an environmental project firstly into my mind and then into the institution. And it got quite far and it got to a certain point. And then, of course, once it meets the established structures of that institution, there are also frictions and limitations and things to negotiate. And that is part and parcel of the project. In 2028, the Hardwick Art Foundation, which I just joined, is opening a museum in the former courthouses of Amsterdam. And they're currently working in the building to transform the building into a performance space, exhibition spaces, all kinds of common and public spaces, and also living spaces for practitioners of different disciplines. But the idea and what we've been talking about with director Beatrix Broof has really been about how to build out from here the notion of the museum as an entire ecosystem. Really think about the way ideas, research projects, artworks, and also publics will be moving through the entire organization and be supported to exist at different stages of their journey. They might be born around the kitchen table of the apartments and then be supported to exist somewhere else in the building. They might leave the building and come back. And so to really think about, well, if we take this museum, it's a big concrete block, so really we're looking at a very human built environment, but we look at that building, we start to make adjustments that make the building a lot more climate responsive and climate responsible than it's the shell that it comes from, but also, and maybe even most crucially, thinking of the entire building from a biomimetic perspective and thinking about how we can make it grow from here to there and how we can make it thrive. At the same time, how will it exist within the ecosystems of Amsterdam? So for me, as a practitioner of, let's say, systems and ecology, I'm also interested in ways in which we can keep the research part and the development part of the building and of the institution alive all of the time. So we came up with a role, it's called Head of Research and Emergence, which is essentially an R&D role, a role that looks at advanced prototyping and systems kind of building, through the organization, through the infrastructure, through the programs, and so on. Often torn between the notion of hope and the notion of grief, I must say. I think I live inside both. A position of grief puts us in a place of stasis, of inaction, of nihilism, of ultimately disconnection and neglect. And a position of hope might obfuscate the fact that there are actually much harder conditions of existence today than the one that I'm standing in here. So on behalf of whom do I have any hope? Me, my children, or the frontline communities that an artist I might be working with is committed and devoted to? I think for me that's a really important question. Now, lots of anthropologists and artists and friends and activists that work in frontline contexts speak about survival, survivance, and something I love particularly is stubbornness. How do you kind of work on stubbornly reclaiming the right to life of our living world? So I would say that I commit myself to stubbornness in the face of either hope or grief, and also something that I really am devoted to, which is a question of tenderness. For me, activism has worked too much and for too long with the same tools that it has been trying to dismantle. Tools of aggressive kind of message pushing and guilt tripping and shaming and so on. I see a much more matriarchal, let's say, way of working through those issues by really caring about forms of tenderness, forms of attention, both towards the planet but also towards each other. And I'm reminded of all the ancestral generations of mothers and grandmothers whose knowledge was actually the knowledge that led humans to learn about their relationship with the planet and how to live in communion with more than human beings. And so it's in honor of those mothers and grandmothers that I hold a position that I try to call attention and tenderness over grief, hope, optimism, nihilism, pessimism, and so on. So tenderness and stubbornness, maybe?